while I was away, there's also a growing populist movement in France. In France. So we already saw Brexit, which frankly, if you pay attention to what's going on in Great Britain, I think they're trying to get out of Brexit. I think the elites, the elite politicians are trying to get out of Brexit, if you ask me. But in France and in Paris, there have been protests starting when I was away on vacation. And of course, you know, idiot journalists and neoliberals like Neera Tanden are making the protests out to be all about exclusively, why are these protesters protesting a carbon tax, which is good for our planet? Of course, that's not what all the protests are about, not even close. So French President Macron has basically done a lot of neoliberal stuff. And this isn't just Macron. Before Macron, France, like Great Britain, has a lot of similarities to America. The rich are getting richer. The politicians are doing things for the people who donate to them and the corporations, and they're not actually doing anything for the people they represent. So France has seen, price hikes, stagnant wages, very similar things to the United States. So here is just one example of what you're seeing as far as the protesters protesting in France. That's from our Russian spy friends at RT. Thank you to them. Now, do sane people think that what they just saw over the last week or so is just over a carbon tax? No. And by the way, the police, like in America, are beating the living shit out of a majority peaceful protesters in France. But if you follow interviews from a lot of these yellow jacket protesters, are they yellow jackets or yellow vests? I always get that confused. I think it's yellow vest. If you follow interviews, if you follow tweets, these are people that have very similar stories to you and to me and to other Americans. Gilets jaunes, yellow vests. Thanks. I've watched interviews with, mothers who are working 2 jobs and barely getting by with the high prices for things in France. I've watched interviews where people are complaining that Macron is, to tackle climate change, is increasing prices on middle-class people rather than the corporations and the wealthy. Sound familiar? Sound familiar to America? Oh, we're going to tackle climate change. We're going to tackle, greed. We're going to tackle this. We're going to tackle that. Here's a tax increase on you workers. But we're not going to tax the rich. We're actually going to cut taxes for the rich and the corporations. Same thing happening in France. Same thing. And again, have to say hi to my friend Neera Tanden. Again, Neera Tanden. I just don't understand why any progressive is cheering French protesters who are massing against a carbon tax. Oh, God. Oh, God. Because, A, since you're not a progressive and you don't know what the fuck you're talking about, it's not over exclusively a tax, carbon tax. Michael Cooper, he gave the 1%ers a tax cut too. Thank you very much. It's really, stronger coffee, much better wine and bread, but similar story economically to America. Just keeping it real. Corporate welfare. The corporations are literally running the government in France, just like they're running the government here. And to offset budget problems and debt, we're going to tax the workers. We're going to take away worker benefits. We're going to tax them more while cutting taxes for our special interest donors. Here's from the BBC. Macron promises to raise wages. He's going to raise wages, Macron says. How? We'll tell you later. France's President Emmanuel Macron has promised a minimum wage rise and tax concessions in response to weeks of violent protests. And all the media, they always put violence protests. Well, yeah, it's kind of violent when the police are literally beating the living hell out of peaceful protesters. Yes, there's some looting. Yes, there's some protesters who are, more aggressive, but it becomes violent when the police are literally, to intimidate and silence dissent, beating the living hell out of majority unarmed people. Very similar to the U.S. And they are armed to the teeth, like a military occupation in France, like in Standing Rock and other places in America. France has seen 4 weekends of violent protests against fuel tax rises, living costs, and other issues. So maybe, somebody could alert Neera Tanden and other Hillbots. It's not just over a carbon tax. Speaking in a televised address, Macron condemned the violence but said the protesters' anger was deep and in many ways legitimate. The minimum wage would increase by £100 per month from 2019, he said. I always get that wrong. Is that euros or pounds? I think it's pounds. A planned tax increase for low-income pensioners would be canceled. That's good. Overtime pay would no longer be taxed, and employers would be encouraged to pay a tax-free end-of-year bonus to employees, he added. Encouraged. I'm sure they'll take you up on that, Macron. However, he refused to reinstate a tax on the wealthy, saying this would weaken us. We need to create jobs. Oh. He's borrowing, he's borrowing from Republicans in America. Oh, those generous job creators. Those generous job creators. We cannot tax them because they create so many jobs. Well, maybe if they were creating livable wage jobs, you wouldn't be having the protests in the first place. Because that's the dirty little secret. And it's not just a secret. Corporations go out of their way not to create jobs, whether in America or France. They want to do as much as they can and get as much productivity as possible, even if they have to kill their workers to get it, with the fewest amount of workers as possible. It's called maximizing profits, because they don't care about their workers in France, in America, and in Europe, frankly, because greed is good. Began in the 80s, all the way through to 2018. The minimum wage will be increased by 7%, and the cost of this increase will be met by the government rather than employers, he says. Government Minister Oliver Dussopt told broadcaster BFM-TV the total cost of all the measures is likely to be between 8 billion and 10 billion pounds. Macron had no choice. They wanted more than just a political promise. They wanted measures, banknotes in their pockets, a tangible change in their impoverished daily lives. President Macron got the message. In fact, he had no choice. To have blethered about future challenges and the need for nation building would have driven the yellow vest to distraction. So here, at the core of the address, were 4 simple changes: a rise in the minimum wage, the removal of tax and social charges on overtime, encouragement to employers to give workers a tax-free bonus, and an end to a surcharge on most pensions. Plus, a note of contrition and a promise of a new, quote, national contract. Oh, please. Built on electoral change and wider consultation with the provinces. Talk is cheap. I'll believe all of this talk when I see it implemented in France. But the wider problem in France, in America, and the rest of Europe, workers don't need one-time bonuses, and that would be lovely. But that's not going to dramatically change anyone's life, especially people that are living paycheck to paycheck, because as their productivity has risen, the greedy corporations that have bought off the government in America, and frankly in France too, as their productivity rises, the wages do not, because there's not any mandate on employers to raise wages along with productivity, to raise wages along with inflation. So, you know, giving a one-time bonus is not a progressive economic policy. You know what is? Permanent minimum wage increases that cannot be repealed. Minimum wage increases that match the rise in productivity and inflation. Actual government programs to invest in communities that have fell behind, and government programs that provide jobs like FDR did and more progressive leaders in France once did. I'm not going to pretend that I know French politics as well as American politics, but I do know that there have been more progressive leaders in France that invested in jobs for workers. And guess what? It worked out. It's very, you know, when you provide tax cuts for the wealthy who then don't create a surplus of jobs, when you let companies offshore industrial jobs to other countries like Mexico, China, that's happening in France too, where industry is being offshored, when the politicians are bought off by the companies and the corporations, when you make it more expensive for workers to have pensions because they have to pay more into it, for workers to have health care because they have to pay more into it, guess what? Eventually, workers get fed up and protest. So I say Vive la France. I say protest until Macron delivers. I don't want to just hear the talk about the minimum wage increase. I don't want to just hear the talk about removing these extra taxes on workers. And I want more protests until he raises the tax on the job creators. I don't want to hear, oh, we advise you to give your workers a bonus. Make them give them a bonus. And raise taxes on these companies, particularly the energy companies, for the carbon tax. Raise their taxes. If they want to release greenhouse gases, if they want to destroy this planet, then they need to pay for it. Period. End of story.